Hi, and welcome to Rontime. Today is the 16th of August, 2013. It's the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and Martin Luther King's speech about I have a dream and having seen over to the other side, and I am no longer afraid. So, what happened in the past 50 years? Seems like though Black Americans got the right to vote, they didn't actually get the right to exercise that right in many cases. There's prohibitive poll taxes, there were registration cards required, ID cards required by certain states and not others. Many things to make the process of voting as difficult or expensive as possible to eliminate people that weren't going to spend the money and put in the investment of time, etc. And it's really interesting because in spite of all the work of the Republicans and all of the money spent by the Koch brothers to try to swing Romney into the presidency so that they would have a businessman running the country rather than someone who had studied constitutional law. In spite of all their money, they lost. And a black man was elected for the first time to be president of the United States. Re-elected, interestingly enough. So, in the first 4 years of the president's term, every 37 seconds, an American was arrested for cannabis, a non-narcotic, and in 4 out of 5 cases, those were persons of color. And so we've reached a state in America where 5% of the world's population actually incarcerates 25% of the world's prisoners. And this past week, Eric Holder, Attorney General of the United States, has made a speech to, I believe, the Bar Association in San Francisco, declaring that federal prosecution of nonviolent drug crimes would not include the required mandatory sentencing that was passed by Alec and the Koch brothers to establish and sustain a for-profit prison system in which they get day laborers for 20 cents an hour, building many of their products, which are sold on retail basis, not in fair competition with real businesses who don't have 20 cent an hour prison labor to keep their costs down. So, 50 years ago, in the March in Washington, Jack Kennedy actually tried to talk Martin Luther King out of calling the march off in Washington because he feared that there would be violence and rioting as a result of the existing white bias in surrounding Anne Arundel County, Maryland, and the Washington environment. Inside the Beltway, discrimination was alive and well, and is still today. Now, fortunately, the process of electing the black president, the first black American president, brought into light a lot of information about how elections are run and how the counting is done and whether or not the deballed machines that were used in states like Ohio had any reliability whatsoever in reporting the voting that took place on those machines. Interestingly enough, a company owned by Romney's son, Chip, leased the voting machines to the state of Ohio for the election, and yet that was not in any way considered any kind of a conflict of interest. Kind of reminds me, hearkening back to a prior election where Gore and Bush were practically tied neck and neck in Florida on the popular vote. And the Supreme Court of the United States decided who our president was going to be. And it was a rush to judgment. The numbers, in fact, did prove that Al Gore was the popular elected president in the state of Florida, and therefore the popularly elected president of the United States. And as a result of that decision, Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor has stated that it was an error, in fact, on behalf of the Supreme Court to not allow the process to take the time that it took in Florida to determine who the president was. After all, the elections are in November, the inaugurations are in January. So I believe in hindsight, she realized that by electing Bush president and allowing Dick Cheney to become the vice president, that there were numerous major tactical errors created by that White House for the profitability of the Halliburton Corporation and their buddies in the oil industry who could not keep their hands off of the cookie jar called Iraq. And they even had plans drawn up in advance of the declaration of war that determined which petroleum exploration companies were going to get which portions of the oil fields, even though we weren't even there at war yet. And as you could see, the energy policy of the Bush-Cheney White House was one of pure disaster. Continued sending $175 million every day to Saudi Arabia to buy contracts in crude oil and to fulfill the federal government's insatiable thirst for crude oil. The federal government of the United States happens to be the largest single consumer of fossil fuels on Earth, running all the departments that they run, defense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the vehicles, all the buildings, all the processes they do. They are literally the largest consumer of carbon fossil fuels on Earth. So it actually behooves the federal government to move towards a federal policy on energy that is intelligent, that is sustainable, and that relies on the United States alone for this source of supply. And this could easily be done if the president, in fact, would legalize cannabis in all forms. Cannabis americana, which is hemp, which makes wonderful crude oil, can actually be burned directly into diesel engine. And in fact, Diesel, the engineer who invented the diesel engine, invented it to run on either hemp oil or peanut oil because they were the two cheapest, most readily available oils on Earth. However, the petrochemical industry won all sorts of favors in Congress, and it's against the law to grow hemp in the United States, just as it's against the law to grow cannabis in the United States. And interestingly enough, if it weren't against the law to grow cannabis in the United States, ever since 1984, women with breast cancer could have been treated with tetrahydrocannabinols, and cannabinoids in the bloodstream are proven to kill breast cancer cells on direct contact without any collateral damage. And it's interesting to know that since 1984, the DEA of the federal government of the United States has continued to suppress studies that indicate that there are many medical uses for marijuana and that their job security is more important than the sustainable economy of the United States and a non-chemotherapy approach to breast cancer for women in the United States and eventually around the world. So this war on drugs that Nixon really started in '72 has consumed roughly $135 billion on an annual basis for any number of years. And there's a number of unreported budget items that are also included in the operations of the DEA, the CIA, and their little drug importing business to pay for things that they don't want to go to Congress for approval for. A number of aircraft that used to belong to the CIA have crashed in various jungles in Central and South America in the process of exporting cannabis to the United States for fun and profit by the CIA. So, if the Attorney General of the United States is going to announce that mandatory sentencing is going to be relaxed for nonviolent drug offenders, then I don't understand why this is not a call to completely eliminate those statutes which are not based on fact, have no factual basis, and hearings before the Congress of the United States, the use of a fraudulent artifice is what classified cannabis a Class 1 narcotic, more dangerous than cocaine or heroin, which are only Class 2 narcotics. So very interesting that the President and the Attorney General of the United States expect anyone to trust them or anything that the federal government has to say when for 70 plus years they've lied to us about 2 plants that could have made an enormous economic and scientific difference in the lives of many, many American citizens. Not to mention the fact that in the first 4 years of your administration, there were 2,773,120 Americans arrested for cannabis. That's one every 37 seconds. The time, the effort, the paperwork, the courts, all of those things based on a lie that cannabis is a narcotic and that it is a dangerous drug. The facts do not support this legislation in any way. The facts will indicate when they're released to the American people with 100% truth that for 70 plus years, the federal government has been bending you over the counter and reaming you clean because they made a lot of money, frankly. Look at all the people that are employed in for-profit prisons holding nonviolent, non-dangerous drug offenders because of mandatory sentencing pushed by the Koch brothers and the American Legislative Exchange Council. So it may seem like this is a rather familiar subject for me to continue to harp on, but I'm going to have to continue to harp on it until something is done. I mean, you've had the presidents of Mexico, Switzerland, Colombia, Costa Rica, Panama, all request that you review your policies on cannabis so that they could end their civil wars that they are fighting in the producer sections where all this cannabis is grown, and where 5% of the world's population in the United States consumes 25% of the world's illicit drug traffic. And the same 5% population has 25% of the world's incarcerated prisoners, many of them for nonviolent drug offenses, and 4 out of 5 of them persons of color. So, how long does this have to go on? How long do we have to let the federal government lie to us about something that they know is not true and continue to enforce laws at the local level and at the federal level, costing American people time, money, and quality of life? You know, it's very difficult when you've been arrested for cannabis and you have a record as a felon to fit right back into society after you've paid your debt by being incarcerated for minimum sentencing. When you're incarcerated, you're exposed to gangs, you're exposed to prison violence, you're exposed to jail behavior, which includes assault, rape, and murder. Quite frankly, it's not safe to be a prisoner in the United States if, in fact, you're just there for a nonviolent drug crime and you're surrounded by these clowns that are in there for murder one. And don't tell me that they aren't mingled. In fact, in the for-profit prison system, there's even commingling between minors who are incarcerated and adults. And in Louisiana, there are multiple reports of sexual abuse of minors by American or correctional corporations of American officers and detention officers and administrative staff. So when you create a system like this where the people who know the facts cannot trust you because you, the President of the United States, and you, the Attorney General of the United States, have failed in 5 years to act on something that you knew was not based on fact, something that you knew was costing you constituents, something that you knew was costing Treasury that needed to be placed elsewhere. I mean, the President actually answered a letter to me when I wrote and asked him to declare April 20th, Harry Anslinger Day, a day of national gardening for cannabis and hemp across the United States. And he indicated that he was interested in keeping a correspondence open with me in looking at these issues and dealing with the recovery of the United States from the housing crisis and the banking crisis and the bailout of the automobile industry. And now the bankruptcy of Detroit, one of the cities that used to produce a lot of the products made in America. So if you're looking for a sustainable economic answer to our current oil crisis and our current energy crisis, it is sustainably possible to grow your way out of a negative economy. It is possible to use hemp and cannabis as oil, pharmaceutical, plastic, and other product sources to turn this economy around, and to do so in a sustainable fashion using modern agricultural technologies. And instead of relying on a law that was written in the 1930s that was not based on fact, then it's time for a serious fact check of every federal statute. I mean, if in fact you're a constitutional lawyer and you taught constitutional law in law school and you edited the Harvard Law Review Journal, then it seems to me that your oath of office would require you to act immediately upon this statute and to rescind it, to take away the records of arrest and all of the damages done to the citizens of the United States by a federal government that was willing to lie to its own people in order to protect federal agent jobs. That, in fact, when the federal revenuers were going to be displaced at the end of alcohol prohibition, those 10,000 Tommy gun certified revenuers went to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and they protected us from that damaging, dangerous weed, cannabis. They did? Right. If you call that protection, then I don't believe we need their services any longer. They aren't protecting anything except the cash flow of some very wealthy individuals who have control of the system. And when the system itself is that corrupted from the inside out, it's time for a review of everything that the federal government has control over. And it's time to ask ourselves the question of why we put them in this position. Why did we allow the Koch brothers to take over the United States, state by state by state, and not notice? Not notice that ALEC was writing legislation that had damaging long-term effects instead of sustainable contributions to an economy. Why? Because it's legislation that protected the few, the wealthy, and the top. It is now time for the United States federal government to take a role of protecting the citizens of the United States from the federal government. The exploitation that has gone on all these years must now end. And the Attorney General, Eric Holder, and the President of the United States, Barack Obama, better sign legislation very soon, completely declaring an end to the war on drugs, the single most failed policy of the United States, and an embarrassment around the world where we required people who wanted to be in the League of Nations to sign international treaties making cannabis a Class 1 narcotic without any scientific proof of its narcotic ability. And because it was declared a controlled substance, you could not even get access to it to do intelligent scientific studies in universities across the United States, and therefore the most current, most relevant scientific studies have not been done in America. They have not been done with our leadership. They have not been done with our belief in democracy and freedom. And so, what they represent at this time is an opportunity for change. And you promised a lot of change when you ran for election. It is now time to see it demonstrated in action. You need to sign the presidential proclamation, Harry Anslinger Day, and make every April 20th a national holiday of gardening for hemp and cannabis across the United States so that we can run an independent economy and we can stop importing oil and start exporting it. We can also begin the exportation of many, many products to our major trade partners like China and South Korea and Europe, so that we actually have a sustainable net exporting economy, and we can bring the deficit of the federal government back down to zero where it was during the Clinton administration. So, again, I'm calling on Mr. Holder and Mr. Obama to step up to the plate and do what they know how to do to actually get something done. And by using the presidential proclamation, using a process that no one can alter. So, that's it for Rontime this time. I've griped enough about this subject. I hope to see some positive change. Until next time, Have a nice day.